mariachi youth group from St. Mary's Church out in Caldwell, Idaho. Let us welcome my friend Rudy Rodriguez and his group, and they're going to be coming around. They're going to be coming around to your tables and play. So let's give them an enthusiastic hand right now.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. And we've been together for about 14, 15 years. But as the mariachi, we have, I want to introduce you from my right to the left. The mariachi was made by me because I wanted to see kids stay in school. Because how many times do the Hispanic students play Go Tell a Rodeo home? Not very often. How many times do you hear Volver? How many times do you hear Rancho Grande? You hear it all the time. So we started the mariachi to keep kids in school, and that's our idea here. On the right-hand side, we have Monica Salinas, who plays the guitar in Nampa in the 6th grade. She's 12 years old, and I have a feeling that my other mariachi that I have is going to try and steal it from this band here, but it's not going to happen though. But you'll hear her sing in a minute. The little boy on the vihuela is my son. His name is Sebastian. He's 9 years old, and he's a little sick today, but he plays the vihuela very well. And he's starting to play with my other mariachi with us. He's performing with us now. On the violin, we have Fancy Ramirez. She's 14 years old in the 8th grade. She plays the violin for the mariachi, Los Niños. and my daughter plays a trumpet, and she goes to school in Michigan. I think I'm going to have our next song going to be Pio Pio Pirata, or one of the others. Most of our music that we sing is we learn from church, because I think that we need all the help we can from God to help us with our group. A lot of patience, a lot of time to work together. So we have a lot of music that we sing Malaysia Rancheras. Right now we're trying to raise money to go play in Arizona at the contest in April, and we'll be around for a long time. That song we're going to sing is very popular by the mariachis. It's called Volver, Volver.
who is from the Al-Haba congregation here in Boise, the Beth of Israel. So if you'll kindly bear with us, he'll be up here and he's going to give us a little word, a blessing.
I was just thinking of one quick anecdote. Last spring, we took a long drive to Phoenix, and we had dinner at a Mexican restaurant where there were mariachi singers. I won't ask this if you maybe come to my table, but we have a 9-year-old son, and when the mariachi singers came to our table and said, "You have a request," our son said, "Can you play the William Tell Overture?" In the High Holiday Prayer Book, it's worship services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There's a prayer that's called a prayer for our country. It's a long prayer, so I took 2 sentences out of it. And I thought they were relevant. They say, "May all the peoples that make up this great commonwealth consecrate their efforts under thy guidance to the cause of liberty, equality, and justice. May we remain united in purpose, respecting each other's rights, and striving together with resolute hearts and willing hands for the welfare of all the inhabitants of our land." And as a blessing, if you have a piece of bread, just take a bite of it after this. And the way this blessing is said in Hebrew is Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Translated, that means, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." Hearty appetite.
song I'm going to sing is a song that was composed by Santos Salinas, the father of Monica. And it says, I want to be a lawyer. Because probably can't make any money as a mariachi, so to be a lawyer. So a song was composed from Napa, from Santos Salinas, and you guys said, licenciado. This last song that we're going to do for you is called Mi Linda Esposa. And this song I'm going to dedicate to my friend Jesse Berain and to his most dear wife, Andrea. This song is about when, now that we're getting older, our kids have gotten married, our hair's getting gray, and I love you with all my heart, and I plan to be with you. And the only way that can separate us is by death. And for the people who've known Andrea and Jesse Berain, they've gone through a lot of troubles and they've gone through a lot of problems. Their kids have grown up and they're still together. So this song I want to dedicate especially for Andrea and Jesse Berain. Como en aquellos tiempos de
know, when you see things like this, you know that all of the youth are not into drugs and not into problems. Most of the youth are into good stuff and good things, and we appreciate that. There are few politicians that I know that I appreciate. I don't know if that's a good statement or not, but that's about the way I feel. The person that I'm going to introduce falls into the category of those politicians that I have known and admired. The individual comes from my part of the country, where I first came in, over in the Magic Valley. He's an attorney. He's a former Attorney General of this great state of Idaho. But he's even more than that. Whenever we have asked him to support the bills to strengthen malicious harassment, he has always been there. He has attended all of our 5 conferences that I know of and has been highly supportive. Jim Jones also is a single parent, and for that I admire him. He's taking care of his young girl, and he is one of the most decent human beings that I know of. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a nice hand of applause for my friend Jim Jones.
Well, thank you, Jesse. Geez, I feel really humble. I don't know what to say. I want you to know I was out this morning at 9:30 putting up the soccer net for my daughter's soccer team. It felt like a drowned rat. And I left about halfway through the game, and they were winning, but the score was even. Not exactly sure how that works. Well, you know, it's really a pleasure to be with this group. You know, I'm not a... Somebody came up to me in the store and said, "You used to be somebody, didn't you?" I'm not anybody anymore, just an average citizen. And actually, it's not that bad. I'll tell you, it's really nice to go to a college campus, though. I've been asked about a half dozen times what my major is. It's really a boost to your ego. I've been given a task that, well, it's really not a task for me. It's a pleasure. As Jesse said, you know, sometimes you get a real jaundiced view of politicians. And when those politicians happen to be lawyers, it's even worse. But not always, not always. Sometimes you meet a person who is really a credit, not only to his profession or various groups that he belongs to, but really to the human race. And we have such a person who is going to be our luncheon speaker today, Bob Spire from Nebraska. I've known Bob for, 5-6 years? Bob was appointed as Attorney General of Nebraska. And I have to tell you, you know, he's Chief of Staff for Senator Kerry from Nebraska. Bob is a Republican. He was appointed by a Democrat governor. And so it kind of shows that maybe there was some chemistry there, more than just party politics, but something that bound some people together. And I think as you hear a little bit more about Bob, and as you hear him today, you'll know what it is. Now, I could introduce him as having been the Attorney General. He was appointed, then he stood for election. He served 5 years. And I've known him in the AG's Association. I can tell you that. I can tell you that he's received numerous distinctions. I guess that's pretty much contained in here. The Torch of Liberty Award from B'nai B'rith. Been honored by the members of the group had to go into the kitchen. Bob didn't stand for that. He refused to go out there too and took his meals in the kitchen with everyone else. When he went into the AG's office, and I don't know if it had been this way forever or not, but he did not have in that office of 65 staff members anyone who was a minority person. By the time he left, 20% of the people working in his office were minority folks. But what really impressed me about Bob was when he decided that he was not going to run for re-election a couple of years ago. I received something in the mail that I thought was really a description of the man I had known for 5 years. And I want to read this part. I'm not going to read this whole press release to you, but I'd like to read a part of this press release. Bob prefaced it by saying that he was not going to run, but here's a part of what he said. There are critical Nebraska justice issues which cry out for constructive action. I have addressed these issues before, and I intend to do so vigorously during the next year. I can do this more effectively if I am not at the same time seeking re-election. For example, we must confront crime, particularly drugs, by doing more than just strengthening law enforcement. Let us attack the degrading social conditions which breed crime. This is necessary to give our youth, often trapped hopelessly in poverty, an alternative life, an alternative hope for the future. We must present to our youth moral values as the basis for legitimate, not criminal pursuits. Our nation's personal greed affliction, our watch out for number one ethic, our obscene emphasis on the acquisition of unneeded luxuries, these characteristics reflect a bankrupt value system. In short, we are being engulfed by a culture of self-indulgence. This contributes to drug, criminal activity, cutting across all economic, ethnic, and racial lines. We should develop effective prisoner rehabilitation and alternate means of incarceration programs. The long-term solution to prison overcrowding is not the building of more prisons and warehousing of more offenders. Racism, sexism, bigotry, fear, and ignorance are a cancer within our system. Government and private enterprise together must address these critical issues of human dignity. They are legal issues only because society fails to meet its moral obligations. And that's the kind of guy that Bob Spire is. Bob, would you come up and share some wisdom?
Jim, you're very, very kind. You may sense that we, as State Attorneys General, are a mutual admiration society, but we're really not. But I do want to say this, that in the time that I spent as State Attorney General in Nebraska, I was constantly aided and assisted by Jim Jones, who was in office out here and was one of the true leaders of our group nationally. And when I came into office, I knew absolutely nothing about being a state official. I'm not sure I ever learned anything about it. But I do know that Jim Jones was exceedingly helpful. And more important, he was one that related to all of us and was completely free with his time and good counsel. Jim, all of us are in your debt for that, my friend. There's one other thing, although I appreciate very much that thoughtful introduction, I would say that it's not difficult to be humble as a former state attorney general and what I'm doing now. For example, when I left the private practice of law, I was in a small 5-person law firm in Omaha, and I realized I was not indispensable. But nonetheless, I was replaced by a part-time law clerk. And even more to the point, after I'd been in office for a year, my office, we had been in a rather modest downtown law building in Omaha, quite modest quarters for some 30 years. A year after I left the office, the firm moved out to a brand new Tiny, I would simply say one last thing, and that is that I think the essence of this conference, and the reason that I'm so honored and pleased to be here, is that the relationship of all of you. And I noticed this so much last night when I was present at the dinner, and a wonderful entertainment by the Montana Logging Ballet Company. I've never heard anything like that in my life. A great musician, but indeed a moving message all the way through. The sense is that everybody in this room, there is a sense of humility among everybody, because my own thought is it's a basic sense of humility that is essential to self-respect for other people. The minute any of us start to think that somehow we individually are better or are superior forms of the species, we lose that sense of humility that is what's essentially necessary to bind us together. In 1956, during the Montgomery bus boycott, which was really the event that launched the modern civil rights movement, there was an elderly black woman who was honoring that bus boycott. She was walking 3 miles every day from downtown Montgomery out to a suburban home where she worked as a domestic, and she was in very poor health, and she had a very difficult time making that walk each day. And after she'd been doing this for about 5 weeks, by that remarkable young Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King, sat her down one evening and he said, we know that you're with us. You're having a difficult time making that walk, and those empty buses go by you every day. And we know that you are with us, and therefore, you go ahead and feel that you get on that bus and ride the bus. Because we do have concerns about your being able to make the march, and we do know that you are with us. And she looked Dr. King right square in the face, and she said, Pastor, I'm going to keep walking. I'm not going to get on those buses. My feet's is tired, but my soul is rested. That's a remarkable statement. Compare that sense of commitment, if you please, to one of our state college coaches in Nebraska a few years ago, not the Big Red, but one of the state college teams. Before the season started, he announced, he said, this year we definitely will have an improved season. Last year we lost 10 straight games. This year I've only scheduled 9 games. The point being that what we're all about is not trying to do less to face up to the problems and concerns we have, not to back off and take less challenges, but indeed step up and take on the greater challenge. And indeed, to speak clearly and succinctly to what those challenges are. A message that I certainly get from this gathering. It is a remarkable effort of the wonderful panelists and speakers to really identify the issues and speak to them, and not a lot of mumbo jumbo or not a lot of political double talk and that sort of thing, but speak very directly to the issues and no ambiguity. I think with the World Series going on right now, I recall a piece of remarkable baseball history when the late, great Dizzy Dean, one of the great pitchers of all time, got beamed in the World Series, and they carried him off the field and out cold, and he came to a little bit later, and he was up on his feet, and the press was interviewing him afterwards, and they got a question. He said, well, Dizzy, how are you? Are you all right after getting beamed? And he said, oh, I'm fine. The doctors x-rayed my head, and they couldn't find anything. So I think what we do is we speak clearly, and in talking about the civil rights legislation today and how it fits into the greater context that this conference is about, I'm reminded of 2 statements of my favorite philosopher, who's Yogi Berra, the great former catcher and coach. Berra really has some wisdom, and he said 2 things that have stuck in my mind, among others. He said one time, if you don't know where you're going, you're apt to end up someplace else. And then he also made a statement that I have a good memory, but it's short. And I think what we need when we talk about civil rights issues is, first of all, to have a good memory and know from whence we've come. And then secondly, to know where we're going, to have a definite sense of direction so that we have someplace we can end up and we don't end up to someplace else we don't want to be. And in that sense, I think in looking at civil rights legislation today, it's very important to think back and recall the history of the last 30 years and over the last 30 years. And to recall how for a period of time, really starting in the 50s, in the early 50s, you had both courts, primarily federal courts, and the legislatures, primarily the United States Congress, that were at the forefront of advancing civil rights issues. You had, of course, the remarkable Brown against the Board of Education decision in May of 1954. The school desegregation case may have been the greatest legal decision of this century. And you had the various civil rights acts, 1964, 65, the Voting Act, and so forth, where Congress itself was moving forward, and the legal system certainly was moving forward, and you had an effort by those two branches of government, with some help from the executive, all attempting to move the civil rights, the civil liberties movement in a definite direction. But of course, as we know what has happened in recent years, and particularly in the last 12 to 15 years, we've had a reversal of that. We've had, in effect, the legislatures, and in particular the United States Congress, backing away. We've had a very definite backing away by the courts, and in particular the federal courts. And specifically, we had in 1989 a series of approximately half a dozen decisions by the United States Supreme Court that substantially eroded the opportunity of citizens to bring in court cases of discrimination. Now, I will briefly touch on a few of these. I'm not going to go into a litany of these in detail because we can all read them, and I'd like to put this in a broader context. But I warn you, when you read any of these civil rights cases, to never lose sight of the fact that you're talking about actual people in these cases, because you know most cases you read, even civil rights cases, are not that exciting to read. You know, there are three types of legal writing. Three types, and only three types of legal writing: boring, extremely boring, and comatose. So again, you need to look at the social issues involved. But essentially, in several cases in 1989, just a kind of an onslaught on civil rights, the United States Supreme Court, in a number of cases, took away, if you please, certain rights that had been established primarily through earlier court cases. These had to do with burden of proof, improving discrimination, had to do with when consent decrees involving affirmative action can be attacked or not attacked, and a number of other issues. And therefore, the civil rights legislation that apparently is going to be enacted now based on an apparent compromise of yesterday between the Senate and the White House deals in an effort to reverse some of those decisions and then attempt to put back the rights involved to where they were before the 1989 cases. But in looking at that, I think the important thing to remember is not just the details of the individual cases, which in essence are a lot of legal nitpicking. In other words, one of the big issues involved in all of this, where there's been an apparent compromise now, is a so-called disparate impact cases where a plaintiff can show examples, specific example. I'm in a community, let's say I'm an African American, and I'm in a population area where the population of African Americans is 30% in the community, and the percentage of African Americans that work for the X company is 1%. And so that's the so-called disparate impact. So the question is, well, is there racial discrimination there that there aren't more African Americans working at that company? What's happening is the question of business under this new legislation is required to be able to show that whatever their business practices are in employment, that there was a, quote, business necessity, end of quote. However that may be defined, but nonetheless, those are strong terms. A business necessity that required the fact that there was that kind of a disparate impact on employment. In other words, there's some legitimate business reason why more minorities in that case weren't hired. That was the so-called quota issue that the administration has talked sort of thing. But the point is, this is all a lot of legal balancing around and kind of dancing on the end of a pin. And the point I want to make today is that the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which apparently will be enacted, although it's still got to go back to the House, because the House version is not what the Senate has agreed to a compromise with the White House. So it's not enacted yet by any means. My view is that out of this will come a bill that will be a net plus. But my fear is that there will be many people, when the bill is enacted, will then rub their hands together and say, well, fine, now we've solved the civil rights issues. We finally got this bill through after 2 years of real trench warfare between civil rights groups and the administration. So now that's accomplished. And I think that would be a very unfortunate reaction, because for one thing, the bill is not that strong, and secondly, it's my thought that the legal cases in and of themselves, the actual lawsuits, are not going to solve the many civil rights issues. In other words, the degree of racial discrimination, sex discrimination, bigotry, religious bigotry that we have in our country is not going to be resolved by lawyer arguments over what the meaning of disparate impact or business necessity is in some obscure federal court somewhere working its way up through the federal system. Those cases can be helpful, but the real battle for civil rights and for the issues that we care about are really what you're all about in this room, what we as citizens have to do out in our very lives in an action sense, in a citizen action sense, and going after legislative bodies in a legislative sense. And yes, using the legal system where you can, but it's much broader than that. What I would like to do in order to kind of talk about the meaning of this civil rights legislation and how it fits into our overall context and what can we learn about it is kind of look at really two subjects. I want to discuss briefly some of the kind of standard what I would call right-wing or ultra-conservative Cro-Magnon arguments that are used against actions of a civil rights nature, generally used to oppose bills such as the Civil Rights Act of 1991 and the earlier civil rights legislation. And I want to discuss those a little bit, but before doing so, I again want to talk about how attitude is so important. You know, the late Texas billionaire J. Paul Getty, the great oil billionaire, wrote a long article shortly before his death expounding on some of his theories of life, and I remember two quotes that just jumped right out of that article. One of them was that he was commenting upon his view of religion in life, and he said, well, yes, I'm a religious man. I understand that the meek will inherit the earth, but not its mineral rights. And then he went on and he ended the article by saying that my advice to young people today is that there are 3 ways to succeed, and if you do 3 things in your life, you can be a big success. And that's all I did, was just 3 simple things. It's get up early in the morning, work hard all day, and discover oil. Now, set that up, if you will, against the statement that we lawyers, I think, find as appropriate now as it was 2,500 years ago. The ancient Athenian jurist Solon, 2,500 years ago, at the time of Pericles, he says that true justice will only come when those who are not hurt are as indignant as those who are. In other words, the problems of the victims are every bit as much the concerns and problems of the non-victims. And then again, if any of you are ever in Hartsdale, New York, by all means, visit the gravesite of Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was a remarkable person. He was a great athlete, he was a great actor, he was a lawyer, he was a great musician, magnificent musician. Above all else, he was a true fighter for civil rights. And on Paul Robeson's gravestone in Hartsdale, New York, there is carved right in stone a statement that Paul Robeson made during the Spanish Civil War when he was speaking out. And the statement is this, quote, "The artist must elect to fight for either slavery or freedom. I have made my choice. I had no other alternative. Now that's a profound statement, and I suggest to you that that's really what we're all about here. You know, we really don't have any other alternative than to do what the coalition is doing. We don't have the alternative of sitting back and not stepping forward and taking some responsibility. But let me talk about, I want to mention briefly just 4 kind of standard things that one hears. First of all, the argument that civil rights litigation representing women, minorities, others who have been discriminated against is simply a boon for lawyers, that we lawyers file these lawsuits, and then some of the federal cases, we can get attorney's fees, and it's just a way for, it's just a holiday for lawyers. In other words, the fact that lawyers are generally unpopular, I recognize that, is then used to divert people's attention from the issues. In other words, bash the lawyer. It's these bad lawyers will criticize the lawyers for bringing the cases, rather than devote the attention to whether or not the person involved really has been injured in some manner. It's the divert people's attention technique, and I think it's something that you need to watch for. We're seeing the Vice President do that now in a number of ways. The Vice President of the United States is out bashing lawyers because we lawyers have the ferocity and all to bring lawsuits questioning some of the social policies of the administration. So rather than face up to those issues, let's bash those lawyers and just say they're bad people. Then secondly, the so-called quota issue. You know, this really bothers me because the present civil rights legislation is clearly, I think any lawyer that studies it and anybody that's worked in the area, regardless of how one may feel about anything else, could not, in all honesty, call it a quota bill. The law that it changes, companies were not using quotas to respond to the Riggs decision that it was in response to. So for 18 years, nobody's been using quotas as a defense on this, and for the administration to say that it's a quota bill is simply, in my judgment, not responsible. But that quota concept, that idea of pitting whites against black, and in particular pitting working class, primarily blue-collar whites, against blacks. The idea is that this is the kind of the Jesse Helms philosophy when he was running in North Carolina against Harvey Gantt, a remarkable person. The idea that, by golly, these blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans are going to come along and they're going to take this white person's job away. And that therefore, I, the white politician, will protect you white employees from the encroachment of these minorities. I mean, that quota argument, it's a phony argument, and it needs to be addressed head on. It needs to be just, people just need to stand up and say, wait a minute, that's a phony argument. Third point is what I call the blame the victim syndrome. We're seeing an awful lot of that these days. I'd suggest 2 books that you ought to read by the same author that have come out in recent years. One of them either 2 or 3 years ago. The author's Jonathan Kosel, a school teacher originally from Boston. 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote a book called Rachel's Children, which describes the homeless situation in this nation, but primarily New York City as an example. Then just within the past month, he has a new book out called Savage Inequalities, which is a vivid description of schools in inner cities and in some rural areas in which the children just have no chance at all at schools. And when you look at those, you really see the victims. And then you realize that the concept of saying, well, these people, if they just go to work and solve their problems, is absolutely immoral and irresponsibility. You know, in Man and Superman in 1907, George Bernard Shaw, writing in 1907 in Man and Superman, there's that wonderful statement where Shaw has one of the lead characters say, the haughty Americans subjugate the American Negro as a bootblack, and then say that he has nothing to offer because he is only a bootblack. That's George Bernard Shaw writing in 1907, and that's still sound today. And you know, this kind of wisdom does not need to come from somebody that well educated. I think the greatest wisdom comes from everyday people. One of my personal friends is a Hispanic American by the name of Ray Ramon in Omaha, Nebraska. Ray is now retired, but for many years he was the night security guard at a downtown office building where my law office was in downtown Omaha. And Ray had been through all of the problems of discrimination. He'd been a migrant worker at one time in Southern California and so forth, all through this. And he and I keep in touch and correspond from time to time. I had a letter from Ray not long ago in which he had this statement, and I just love it. There's real wisdom in it. He said, I say, what difference does it make whether you're white, black, brown, male, female, or anything else? We're all in the same boat. And if the boat sinks, we all sink with it. That's so true. And to me, that's so self-evident. And this comes from a person that's been through. But I think we need to keep our eye on that. So again, we don't blame the victim. And then finally, I get awful tired of the kind of right-wing argument of this so-called liberal bias in the media. That every time the media writes a news story about the National Organization of Women, or about NAACP, or about any of these civil rights groups, somehow that's some liberal bias, and that they ought not to be doing that. The blunt fact of the matter is that the statistics are overwhelming that the media in this country, television, radio, newspapers, are controlled primarily by Republicans, not Democrats, which tends to make them more conservative. But the idea that the news media is biased in favor of the liberals and we're just getting a bunch of liberal news out there is, of course, not true. It's again a red herring. It's an effort to divert attention from the problems. In other words, blame the lawyers, yell quotas, blame the victims, and then blame the media, rather than look at the issues and say, look, is there discrimination? Is there harassment out here? Is there something we ought to be doing and address the issue? Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned just briefly, just 5 political issues today that I think bear on civil rights and part of the context of which our civil rights bill is just in process is in. First of all, the Thomas appointment. Now, briefly speaking, and regardless of how anybody else may feel about that, let me just be very candid about it. It seems to me that what we need to recognize, and I find this very disturbing, is that with the Willie Horton ads, you have the pitting of black against white. With the quota issue, you again have more white against black divisiveness. Then you have the Clarence Thomas appointment, which serves the purpose then of pitting black against black. And this is a policy of divisiveness politically. And it seems to me that if you look at the history of the world, if you look at Northern Ireland, for example, you could Union South Africa, its history. Look at those kind of things. You see where this divisiveness, when it really gets out of control, is really, really bad. And therefore, that concept of divisive politics needs to be recognized as such and not accepted. We need to stand up to it, which leads me right into point number 2, what I call the David Duke syndrome. Not only David Duke personally, but what he represents. I suggest to you that the fact that you've got a David Duke out there is because for the last approximately 12 years, right from the top of this nation, we've had the idea that bigotry and not caring about discrimination and these sort of things is acceptable. So when you have that coming right from the top, nobody really caring from the top, then you get the crazies that come out like a David Duke, and then he can speak and claim some legitimacy. But the Duke thing is frightening because David Duke is saying to the people of Louisiana, there's a high unemployment down there, and there's some real economic problems, and he's spewing out this old line of, well, your problems are due to 3 things. Number 1, your problems are because of the racial minorities. That's your problem. Secondly, tied to it, affirmative action. And then third, government's an enemy. Anything that government tries to do in this connection is bad. Now that message is very similar to the Hitler message of the 20s. You know, Hitler went to the Germans in the late 1920s and he said, look, your economic problems here are all a result of the Jews, the scapegoats. And you just get rid of the Jews and get them out of this way and you'll be all right, and I'll take care of that. And so again, this scapegoating, if you please, which is what Duke does, provide scapegoats rather than look at the problems. What can we do about unemployment? What can we do about some of these issues? Instead of doing that, you look at you try and scapegoat, you try and blame minorities, you try and blame others, blame government, blame somebody that's trying to resolve the issue. And that's very dangerous, it's divisive, and it's that kind of divisiveness that we simply can't have in our society today. And I don't know how you get people's attention to this. Part of it is that people just yawn quietly and they don't worry much about it. They go, well, David Duke will pass in this political scene. Well, I certainly hope he does. But maybe it's that they'll get attention. I recall, speaking of getting attention, let me give you a perfect example. A number of years ago, there was an outfit in Hong Kong that was publishing American songs violating our American copyright law, this Hong Kong outfit. And this was a great sore to the American music publishers and indeed to the musicians union, because this was taking money out of the hands of American musicians and American publishers. And if there's any group that's not a big lobby in Washington, it's musicians. You know, the musicians in Washington are not like the gun lobby or the China lobby, the National Chamber of Commerce. But at any rate, couldn't get anything done about this. But finally, the American Federation of Musicians and the Music Publishers Association of America got Senator Spong of West Virginia to introduce some legislation outlawing this practice, with just some dull copyright legislation that nobody would even notice in the great congressional mainstream. But Spong had the wit to get Senator Fong of Hawaii and Senator Long of Louisiana to join him as co-sponsors. And so what otherwise would have been just a dull piece of copyright legislation with a weak lobby behind it became known in Washington social circles around the Hill as the Spong Fong Long Hong Kong Song Bill. It got a lot of attention. It sailed through Congress. The president signed it in a Rose Garden ceremony, and the problem got resolved. So part of it is one way or another to get people's attention. And I don't know quite how you do that, but maybe in a negative sense, maybe it's a David Duke. Maybe it takes a David Duke to get our attention, or our attention. There's rooms already there, but to get the attention of this nation to how we better really start worrying about some of these things. And then finally, I just want to mention one aspect which I think goes so much to the area of civil rights, is that we're losing in our country, I think, a sense of civility in discussing political issues. We tend to attack people rather than issues. If someone is trying to promote a social issue, then the attack is not on the issue being unsound, but on the person that is bringing the attack. And I think that is exceedingly unfortunate. I think an example of that is what I've found to be, I thought, an absolutely immoral effort to discredit the testimony of Anita Hill in the Thomas hearings. Now, rather than, and some of you may have seen the detailed coverage of this in the New York Times, but rather than determine whether or not Anita Hill was or was not telling the truth in her charges of sexual harassment by Judge Thomas, the effort, which was a conspiracy led by the Counsel for the White House, working with the Justice Department, the EEOC, and the Republican senators on the committee. The effort was not to determine the truth of her testimony, or the lack thereof, but indeed to attack her, to try and discredit her as a witness, to impugn her character, in order to cast doubts on her, so that people would then tell their senators to vote for the confirmation, and the confirmation battle would be won. Now, that's not the way to go about a civil, appropriate, respectful discussion of how we confirm judges or conduct our political system. So what I really want to say is that patriotism, it seems to me, is not a question of flag waving. Patriotism is a question of caring about people and being able to understand what this great nation is about, and in effect wanting to do something about it. In other words, the good patriot is somebody that says, I love America because America is made up of diverse people of different races and religions and different sexual preferences, different people, and I love this and I want to preserve it and I'll stand up for it. And that's what's great about America, is the people and that whole concept of us being an egalitarian society that works together. And that, in essence, is really what patriotism is. I want to close by saying this about civil rights. I'm old enough that I get discouraged because fighting civil rights battles today that some of us old soldiers thought we fought around 25 years ago. School desegregation and some of these other matters. But I would say it's all well and good for me to stand up here and talk about this, but what specifically can be done? Do I have any suggestions about what we do to make a difference? Well, I have some suggestions. They may or may not work, but I do. I think number one is a matter of attitude. When we look at civil rights issues, let's knock the politics out of it and not make it Democrat against Republican or vice versa or anything else. And let's not waste our time on that, because I think basic civil rights issues, respect for differing types of people, are basic decency questions, which are not, it seems to me, the sole province of any political party or anything else. If these are basic questions of decency that far transcend partisan politics. And therefore, the approach ought to be, everyone ought to be concerned, and we ought to be looking at it primarily non-politically. But secondly, it seems to me we need to attack civil rights issues on a very broad basis. And my specific suggestion is that I do not think we're going to solve the inequality problems in our nation, the discrimination problems against racial minorities, women, others. We're not going to do that just by lawsuits or just by solely by acts of Congress. I think we need to make a broad attack on a lot of the social conditions that bring about the inequality. I may sound like a 60s liberal at this point, but I'll plead guilty to that. I suggest that we need a Marshall Plan type of attack on the major social conditions in our nation. We need to do something major about education, about health care, about housing, about the infrastructure, about a lot of the rural areas. We have to give the young people in this country some way of getting into the mainstream. And unless and until we do that, we're still going to have all of these problems. And I think the ultimate answer to discrimination is to get people into the mainstream. And how do you do that? Well, you get them a decent home, you get them a decent education, you get them a decent job. In effect, you convey the message to them that you care about them, that we as a nation, we care about the children that drop out of the inner city schools. We care about the children that drop out of some of our rural schools. We care about this, and we're going to do something about it. And that's going to take resources. But we can do it. We've shown in this nation that we can fight wars over the years. We can do a lot of things. We can find the resources if we have the commitment. But I think it takes that type of commitment. Let's not disabuse ourselves by thinking that just passing this or that law will solve the problem. This has to be a major commitment. I would close by saying I want to recognize the Northwest Coalition as an exceedingly important group. I really, it just gets my adrenaline flowing to observe not only what you're doing, but the vitality of this group the last 24 hours that I have been here. I particularly commend Bill Wasmuth and Tony Stewart and all of the leadership. It's a tremendous effort, and you set an example for all the rest of us. I want to close by tying into that a statement that I think is really quite important. You know, in order to approach these problems, we've got to be accessible. We've got to be open and listen to other people and listen to them closely. My wife and I have some friends that just retired to Florida, and on their telephone answering, believe it or not, this is a true story. This gentleman, if they're not there, he comes on, it's his voice on a typical answering machine. It says, "Hello, this is Art Geiser speaking. Neither Alice nor I can come to the phone right now, and so please listen for the sound of the beep, and when you hear the beep, hang up." Now, that may be a good way to retire to Florida, to tell people to hang up so you don't have to worry about phone calls when you come off the golf course. But we cannot tell people to hang up. The political system has got to be open and responsive, and we have to keep hammering away there. About 3 weeks before his tragic assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. said that in this generation we shall have to repent, not just for the vitriolic acts of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Now, we are the good people, and you are not being silent. You are going forward, and indeed, and indeed the promises to keep, the theme of this conference. You know, that what promises? Well, the promise is not to be silent. The promise is to go forward. The promise is to fight the good cause. That promises to keep theme is essential to all this. And I suggest to you that if all of us do keep the theme of this conference in mind, promises to keep, and we're not afraid to step out and speak out and do things, that when our day comes, and it will for all of us, each one of us will be able to look in our own God, however we define God, in the face and say, my feet is tired, but my soul is resting. Thank you.
Bob, I think because of the tendency of all of us as part of the human race, and it's a tendency of the human race to stereotype, it's particularly important for us to hear the kinds of message that you gave today coming from a national politician. Keeps us from some stereotyping that I know I was falling into, and I suspect many of us were. You might be the only one. It only takes one to break the stereotype. Thank you very much, Bob. That was an excellent message and something we very much needed to hear.